And if you have any questions or any difficulties in the way of computer issues, please feel free to pop off, pop back in. I will be monitoring the waiting room the entire time. If you have any questions relevant to today's session or have questions after today's session, you can send those along to myself or to Antoinette. But if you have anything that occurs within the session today, you can place it in the chat and I will be monitoring the chat and Antoinette will be addressing those questions as appropriate. So I don't want to keep us any further. One other thing, so this is lesson 1. There is lesson 2 that will be occurring in August. It is recommended that if you know of anyone who will be attending lesson 2, that they do review lesson 1 first. So I will leave you with that and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. Good morning, everybody. I'm super excited to be able to conduct this training for you all this morning. A couple of housekeeping rules. So if you could please remain muted, just because sometimes background noise actually will drown out my voice and people won't be able to hear, that would be fantastic. But I do want this to be an interactive presentation. I don't want to be speaking at everyone. So if you have a question or something about something I'm speaking to, please feel free to put it in the chat. Jen is going to be monitoring that. It's a little hard for me in presentation mode to see chat. So Jen will be monitoring. And if it's really pressing, just unmute, jump in and ask the question. I'm totally fine with that. I will have a couple of polls, live polls. So if you can be so kind as to browse to pollev.com/Antoinette King 686. There are 2 polls in which you have to be logged in to participate. The other poll you can do via text, but it's just fun. It's not a test. There's no exam at the end of this. Really, this first session is to introduce everyone to cybersecurity concepts and language. This is not a highly technical training. So I don't want anybody to think that, they're going to be drinking from the fire hose or anything like that. It's really generally high level concepts of what cybersecurity means, why it's important. And so with that, I'm going to get started. So first I'll do a little bit of an introduction about myself. My name is Antoinette King. I have been in the security industry in general for 22 years now. I started in physical security, but I also back in the late 90s got my Microsoft certification at the same time because I was in college and my advisor had the foresight to understand that physical security and what we called IT back then was going to converge. And so I got a Microsoft certification and actually got hired at my first job as a technician for physical security providers. So I was pulling cable, mounting cameras. That picture up top, that's me at the torch at the Statue of Liberty, installing some wireless equipment across the Hudson River there. And so it kind of allowed me to have a little bit of experience in both the physical and cybersecurity industry from the very beginning. I've been married to my husband for 22 years, but we've been together since high school. So we're coming up on 29, I think, at this point. I don't even know, I lose count. Happily most of the time, of course, I'm sure anyone who's married knows that. I went back to school in my 40s, which, as I mentioned, is not as easy as it was in my 20s, to get my master's degree in cyber policy and risk analysis, because I started recognizing several years back that there was a huge deficit in understanding of how to secure devices on networks if they weren't computer devices, right? So now all of a sudden we're building operational technology that sits on networks. And I started getting really intrigued about what our role as an operational technology industry was to promote and to secure in network systems. So as I went back to school, I started to see things I couldn't unsee. Threats to the global landscape that really reignited my passion for security. I'm one of the rare people that's in the security industry by design. I actually got my bachelor's in managing security systems from SUNY Farmingdale. So it's always been a calling for me. But now this holistic security and understanding of how each individual plays a role in not only our own data privacy and data protection, but in national security. And I'll get into that a little bit later. We have a 7-year-old golden doodle named Avery. And of course, on the right there, my 2 incredible sons. One is Tyler, the other's Dylan. My oldest is 18. He goes to Fordham and he's actually majoring in computer science. He got a full scholarship through the Air Force. So he will be enlisted. Well, he will be enlisted, or he's enlisted. He'll be deployed after college. And the one on the left there, Dylan, he's my 10th grader, and he'll be doing welding at SUNY Boise. So polar opposite kids. But we live right here in Bloomingburg, so I'm very local, and I actually am on the board of trustees for the Mamakating Library. So helping to spread this and evangelize this need for cybersecurity in the library systems and the K-12 environment really is a tremendous passion of mine, and I'm truly honored to be able to do that with you all. So I formed my company a little over 2 years ago after working for corporate America for the majority of my life because I realized that there was a need to support small to medium businesses, K-12 environments, and higher education in things like training, policies and procedures, governance and compliance. And actually just last night finished my first draft edits of a book that I'm writing specific to K-12 audience and also older audience, and it's Digital Citizens Guide to Cybersecurity. So as I said, it's something I'm truly passionate about, and I'm really, that is my life's mission at this point. So I wanted to start off with a poll because a lot of people are intimidated by cybersecurity, and be honest. So coming into this training, before we even started, how are you feeling about it? So if you can log in and kind of drop your pin. If there's any challenges, please let me know. But oh, we see one pin. I see a green smiley face. That's exciting. I love this. I love the optimism. Usually I get more of the oranges and the yellows. I've never had an actual red, but all right. So I appreciate that you guys are excited about this because it makes it easier for me. So we're going to move on and go over the agenda. So the first thing I want to talk about is why is cybersecurity important to the library systems and RCLS. Then we'll get into basic principles of cybersecurity. We're going to get into this. So this third section is going to be the most technical, but it's really not super technical section, and it's applications of cybersecurity. I think that once you understand the basic principles of cybersecurity, getting into some of the high-level applications so that you understand what those things are within your network and within your organization, even if you don't know how to set them up or anything like that, but just knowing the terms is really important. We're going to talk about some of the types of cyber attacks, and then we'll get into staying vigilant. Does anybody have any questions so far about this agenda or anything? All right, so we're going to move on. So I have a couple of really fun videos just to kind of keep things lively and exciting.
This is CSEN News.
Here, if you can give me
Hi, I'm Jody Anderson.
Yes in the chat, that would be great. Sorry, I think I paused it.
All organizations have sensitive data that we need to help protect. Some of it is more obvious than others, like the 11 herbs and spices from KFC, a secret cola formula, or even a baked beans recipe. You'd be surprised what you can get out of a talking dog with just a couple doggy treats. Some of you may have access to executives or key strategic information, like an upcoming merger or a product launch. But for most of us, the sensitive information is more routine, like PII, personally identifiable information that you may have access to on your clients, employees, or students. Be responsible and make sure to take care to protect this information, regardless of your role with the organization. Understand your employer's requirements and don't be the source of the breach of intellectual property. For CSEN News, I'm Jody Anderson.
All right. So next poll. How important is cybersecurity in your role as a library staff member? So I just would like to see, and be honest, you know, this isn't a trick question. I just want you to kind of get a feel for what you think the importance is of cybersecurity in the role that you play within the library. Some people don't touch any technology and some people do. So I'm just curious. I'm sorry, I think the poll was locked. Stand by. Ooh. Oh no. All right, I apologize. I don't know how this got locked. So maybe if you throw it in the chat, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. All right. Wow, yes. John, I know you're a 5. John's probably a 10, actually. All right, perfect. Sorry about that poll being locked. So everybody, well, most people who have answered have indicated that they're somewhat or significantly important, the role of cybersecurity within what you do with the library. And I think that's really good. So why is it important? Here's some of the things that we have to think within your environment when we think about cybersecurity. First of all, we want to protect internal library information and data. And even though some people might think that the information that the data has, or the data that the libraries have, are not significantly important to the outside world, all data has value. The next thing we want to do is make sure that we are mitigating cyber threats and mitigating any risks that might be coming towards the library. So one of the biggest things, and we'll get into it a little bit later, but one of the biggest threats that library systems in K through 12 and even House of Worship face on the cyber realm actually is malware and ransomware. And the reason for that is because these organizations are considered soft targets. Many corporations, government agencies, even higher education, because they do a lot of research, will have a lot of the controls in place that will prevent some of or mitigate some of the risks. In a lot of cases, library systems, the K through 12 environment and House of Worship do not have either the budget or the resources or staffing to implement these types of controls. Luckily, RCLS does a really great job in doing that, but libraries are considered a softer target. And so there have been some really major ransomware attacks against libraries in the recent years. So it's really important to recognize that that's one of the major cyber threats. Privacy, of course, everybody, it's a big buzzword right now. Privacy is very important, maintaining the privacy of your patrons. And then governance and compliance is important as well. You know, we get grant funding from various different sources, and depending on where the funding comes from, if it's state or federal grant funding, oftentimes the receipt of those funds also means that you need to comply with specific regulations when it comes to privacy and data breach notifications. Does anybody have any questions about kind of the why part of it or any other input? Okay, so next we're going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity basics. So there's two things I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about the basic principles of cybersecurity, and then we're going to talk about the opposite, the threats against these principles, because I think it's really important to see both sides of the coin, right? So cybersecurity is based on 3 principles: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And you will hear this being referred to as the CIA triad. And I have a little triangle there to kind of show you what that means. So what does this mean? Confidentiality means that the information that we have on our network systems remains only available to the people who are supposed to have access to it, right? So we want to make sure that that information is protected so that unauthorized people do not gain access to it. What does integrity mean in the case of data? Well, integrity means that the information that we have remains in its original state. It means that nobody has the ability to access the information and then modify that information for any reason. And then finally, availability. So even though we want things to remain confidential and we want the integrity of the data to also remain intact, we also need to make sure that that data is available to the people who need to have access to it, right? So there's this constant balance of all 3 of these essential pieces of cybersecurity. On the flip side of that, the threats that we have against the confidentiality, integrity, and availability are disclosure, destruction, and denial. So as we can see, if we want something to be confidential, the negative side or the data threat for that is the actual disclosure of it. If we want to make sure that data the data integrity remains intact, the destruction or modification of that data obviously would be the threat. And then finally, denial. So this would be if, for example, malware was installed on a computer and all of the data was encrypted. So now you have denied access. But there's another part of denial, which is website defacement, right? So also there's threats to the library's websites where perhaps you have information on the website that is out for the community, or you have the ability to register for things, or you may have services that you utilize through your website. The attack to the website and denying access to the patrons to your website is also another, or defacement of the website is another piece of that denial. So I'm going to go a little bit more deeply into each one. I'm going to go into the CIA triad and also kind of some of those threats a little more deeply. So when we think about confidentiality, we want to think about keeping data private, making sure that only authorized individuals have access to the data, and then making sure that unauthorized users are blocked. And the way that we do this is to look at the types of data that we have within the organization, and then we classify that data. So we determine the sensitivity of the data. Some information is benign. It doesn't matter if the general public sees it. As a matter of fact, sometimes we want the general public to see that data. So we're not going to put controls around things that are generally public information. And that's kind of how we figure out where are we going to spend resources and how are we going to protect the information. So the first step to all of this is ensuring that we understand how our data is classified, and then being able to put the controls around the data in order to keep it confidential. So the next step to that is determining who should have access to the data. So if you're within the library system, for example, and you have invoices that need to be paid, who's responsible for receipt of those invoices, processing of those invoices, and then the payment of the invoices? Sometimes the entry of the invoices is done by one person, and then the payment of the invoices is done by another. And that's called separation of roles. And it's actually part of cybersecurity best practices, because you don't always want the same, if you can, sometimes it's not possible, but you don't necessarily always want the same people that receive invoices to also be the ones that can pay it, because they may be able to modify it, right? They may be able to influence the integrity of the invoices or payments. So just something to think about, you know, what information do we have, then who's supposed to have access to it, and then what have we done to ensure that only those people that are supposed to see that information have access to that information. So I just want to make sure there's no questions about confidentiality. All right. So flip side, data disclosure. What does that look like? Well, there are things like data leak, data compromise, and data dump. So a data leak is when somebody inadvertently puts out information and doesn't realize that it wasn't supposed to be disclosed. Maybe they don't have proper training. Maybe they weren't aware that that information was not public information. A data compromise is when someone actually gains access, unauthorized person gains access to your data source. So that means that the actual database, the information has been compromised. And then a data dump is typically after the compromise has happened. The bad guys is, basically extract the data from the victim and then put that information out on, usually it's on the dark web to be able to be sold. So we implement all of these principles of confidentiality to prevent a lot of this from happening. And when we think about, classifying the data, putting in the controls, and then making sure that only the people who are supposed to have access to that data has access to it, you really start to mitigate a lot of the risk that comes into play when we talk about data disclosure. So here we're talking, when we talk about integrity, we want to make sure that A, the information is coming from a trusted source, B, that the information is correct and it's reliable. And there are ways in which we can watermark information or put things in place to detect intrusion or detect any type of modification of data. So if there is a situation or an environment where the integrity of the information that you're storing is important, we just need to make sure that we have the things in place. So for example, if I'm sending email, you can have something called a digital certificate. And a digital certificate will essentially say that Antoinette King is in fact the person sending this email. And it's my identity has been verified by a third party. I can implement that digital certificate within my email. So now when people receive email from me, they see this little, it looks like a kind of like a sticker, like an award almost. And you see that that certificate is on my email. That means it did in fact come from my computer. That certificate has to be installed on my computer. So that means that I'm a trusted source for the information that's being sent. If you don't have a digital certificate, it is very easy for somebody to send an email on your behalf from a different email address. They essentially spoof the from name, but the actual email address behind it is not from that person, right? And so that's how we think about when we get phishing emails and things like that, and spear phishing emails. That happens because they're spoofing the email address that it's actually coming from. So understanding the integrity of the data and the source of the data is very important. So obviously, the flip side is the data destruction. So we have people tampering with information, we have people deleting information, and then we have misconfiguration. And so when we think about perhaps a compromise of a network system, we can have people coming in and actually changing privileges and changing network configurations in order to do something bad, right? Do something nefarious. So these are also, so it's not just modifying the data, it's also deleting data and then going in and misconfiguring some of the servers. So again, as I mentioned earlier, access to internal data that users are authorized to have access to, right? If we don't have availability to information, we can't perform the services and the job functions that we need to perform. So ensuring that the data is available when it should be, making sure that public facing websites are accessible, and also that all devices are up and running. Some libraries might have iPads, computers, maybe even networked projectors, things that they run a lot of their services on. So making sure that the network is not obstructed so that people have what they need when they need it, and they can perform the services that they have to. So what are some of the denial of access as well? We've got denial of service, or what we call DOS attacks to websites. Internal data encryption, that's when ransomware is in place where someone gains access to the network, locks up all the data, and then requires that you pay a ransom in order to get the data back. And then infrastructure vulnerability exploits. This is a big one. You know, SolarWinds was one of those types of infrastructure vulnerability exploits where the bad actors are looking for vulnerabilities within the hardware and software used within the network infrastructure. And then they utilize those vulnerabilities to gain access and deny services, deny access to your infrastructure. So that's usually kind of the way in which the bad actors will get into the network, is by exploiting vulnerabilities within your infrastructure.
You're watching CSEN, the Cybersecurity Entertainment Network. Here's Jody Anderson.
Hi, I'm Jody Anderson with CSEN. They always say, honesty is the best policy. But you know what the second best policies are? Your cybersecurity policies. Okay, that's not true. Waiting a half hour after you eat before you go swimming is probably a better policy. But still, your cybersecurity policies are important and you should be familiar with them. If you have a question, don't be scared to ask someone in your IT department. Till next time, I'm Jody Anderson.
All righty. So now we're going to talk about types of cybersecurity. First of all, are there any questions about the CIA triad and the risks and threats against those? I kind of popping up here. I don't see anything on the chat right now, so we'll just keep moving forward. So cybersecurity is a very broad term, and it incorporates a lot of different things within networks. So we have information security, which obviously is the actual data. We have network security, which will be the infrastructure on which our devices are running and where our data is stored. So that could include in on-prem devices, right? Anything that's in your facility, but it also can include anything that you're saving in the cloud. And I know that a lot of the libraries utilize cloud services. And so information and data that is stored in the cloud is also part of our network security. And that also overlaps with application security. So application security are the types of applications that we use within our library to perform services. So that can include anything from operational things like paying invoices and collecting payments for late charges, or library services for ebooks and things like that. So understanding the supply chain within your library system and knowing where all of these things lie in the ecosystem is really, really important. And the reason why I bring this up is because not only is it important that within your facility that you practice good cyber hygiene, but as you start to evaluate your suppliers, you need to make sure that those suppliers are practicing good cyber hygiene as well. You don't want to choose a supplier that has a particular application or is a cloud service provider that does not implement best practices and puts your patrons at risk. So as you think about your ecosystem and the things that you do within your library systems to run your programs, start to think about what the relationships are with your suppliers, where they actually fit within the scope of these three categories, and then what are you doing in order to ensure that your suppliers are also providing you with services that meet the best practices for cybersecurity. And now we'll talk about some of the cybersecurity threats. Now, this is not by any means an all-encompassing list, but these are some of the things I picked out that I thought would be most commonly seen within a library system. So email compromise is when someone's email address has been hacked, if you will, and the bad actor gains access to not only your email, but the inbox, but also the outbox and all of your contacts. I've seen, I had a colleague of mine recently have an email compromise, and with that, they gained access to the person who sends out invoices, and they used QuickBooks. So what the bad actor had done was they took they went to the sent folder, figured out who they normally send invoices to, took the invoices that were attached to those old emails, modified them so that the link to pay the invoice went to their bank account, the bad actor's bank account, sent it as if it was coming from the woman that normally sends the invoices. Everything else looked identical. And four of their customers actually sent payments to the wrong bank account. And unfortunately, they were unable to retrieve the funds. And they actually ended up losing a large contract with a state agency that they were working with because this happened. And essentially, the cause of it, the root cause, was that they were using Office 365. And unfortunately, Office 365 does not default certain security settings. And so they didn't have something turned on, and the bad actor was able to exploit that and get in. And so that's why I mentioned about suppliers and relationships with suppliers. If you're using a cloud service provider for anything, whether it's an application or infrastructure, it's really important to ask the questions about the security pieces of it, because most people assume that if you're using a third party to manage something, whether it's a process or infrastructure or storage, like AWS or Azure, you're assuming that they're taking on the responsibility of the security of the information. And that's not always the case. So just be mindful of that. And of course, if you're working with RCLS on something, talk to John, talk to Jen, and ask them, ask them what they think about different various suppliers or security settings. It's really important. Malicious websites, of course, we see this all the time in phishing emails, text messages, things of that nature. And these websites can do anything from obfuscate your credentials to installing malware on your computer. So making sure that the URLs that we are clicking on are safe is really important. Phishing emails, that's probably the number one threat, I think, to all organizations. And if you're not familiar with phishing, basically it is an email that is sent that appears to be legitimate, but is being sent from an illegitimate source with various different options, flavors, if you will, of attack. It could be ransomware, where you click on a link or an attachment and it opens up a file that then installs malware onto your computer. Or it could be looking for other information, personally identifiable information, or credentials, where it makes you click on something, you go to another website, you enter your credentials, and now it's stolen your credentials. This actually happened to me yesterday. I didn't fall for it, but I got a text message appearing to be from Amazon telling me that my account had been compromised and that I needed to click on a link within the text message to log into my account and then change my username and password. And obviously I didn't do that, but if I wasn't astute to it, I may have very easily had fallen for that and clicked on the link in the text message. Ransomware, as I mentioned earlier, is another, it's kind of the second layer of the phishing attack in some cases, as well as malware and viruses, but essentially phishing attack happens through email or other means, maybe a cell phone, through text message, and the malware launches some sort of software that will encrypt or block access to hardware, software, and data on your network. And then the only way to get it back is one of two ways. You pay the ransom and hopefully you get the information back, or you don't pay the ransom and you shut down the network, try to recover from backups, and pray that your backups are not infected as well. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So, applications of cybersecurity. I'm not going to get into the super technical nature of all of these things, but I keep mentioning the word controls. And so when I say controls, these are some of the things that I'm talking about to mitigate risks and threats. So Web Application Firewall, that's basically a tool that's used for your website that should be turned on. And again, I apologize because I'm not familiar with everyone and how their websites are managed. And Jen, I'm not sure if RCLS actually manages websites or not, but if you're managing your own website, you need to ensure that the Web Application Firewall is turned on. Typically, it's there. I can tell you from my own personal experience, when I built my website for my company, I used GoDaddy and I used one of their templates, and probably for 6 months, I went without having the Web Application Firewall turned on. I assumed that it was. And then I was talking to somebody and they're like, no, that's usually something you have to do. And I went in and it was free. They weren't charging me for it, but it just wasn't automatically turned on. So if you're managing your own website, or you have someone who manages your website, just ask the question if that's turned on. It's an important protection for your website. Antivirus, anti-malware. This is pretty, common. Everybody knows about it, but some of the things we don't realize is that we should have this on all of our devices, not just our computers. So if you're utilizing iPads or any kind of tablet devices, on your cell phones, if you have cell phones in which you're receiving your business email, you should have some sort of antivirus, anti-malware software running on those devices. There's also something called an Ids Intrusion Detection solution that's typically put on the network itself, the facility network, and it'll detect if there's any anomalies within your network. You know, people doing things or someone doing something that's out of character for what's done within your network. And then, of course, I personally, and it's not just because I conduct cybersecurity awareness training, but I do believe that it doesn't matter how much money you invest in controls, in technology, the biggest threat to any network typically falls between the keyboard and the chair. In other words, we, the human element, are typically the biggest threat, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And the only way to truly mitigate that risk is cybersecurity awareness training. And I get excited about it. I had an old colleague of mine who said, Antoinette, I wish I could get as excited about cybersecurity as you are, but it's really, for me, like watching paint dry. And so I understand that it's not exciting for everybody, but it's so, so important to keep a security mindset. And it's not just at work, it's at home, because unfortunately, it's no longer, you know, nation states against other nation states. It's really these very large conglomerates and almost businesses of malicious intent and activity that are targeting individuals because they recognize that the individual is the way to get into these larger networks. So just realize that as you're navigating Facebook and Instagram and all these other things, being aware and being vigilant is really important. We'll get into that later, but I can't say it enough. So what are the type of attacks that we have? Business email compromise, phishing, which comes in the form of smishing and vishing. So smishing, if you're not familiar, is SMS text message, which is what I mentioned before. They send a text message to you under the guise of something. I've gotten one even that was an IRS, like the IRS is trying to contact you, so click here to be connected with somebody. And vishing is probably the original, the OG form of phishing, and that is voice phone calls. And that seems to have picked up tremendously. It died off for years. You know, that was the only way people would call and say, oh, your car warranty or whatever, try to get you to do things. That has picked up tremendously. And one of the really important things that I wanted to talk about when it comes to phishing is what I've seen is that the perpetrators will call an organization under the guise of tech support. So this could genuinely be an attack vector for anybody who works with RCLS, because if you're not managing your own infrastructure and you get a phone call from someone saying, hey, I'm with tech support for your computer system, and we recognize that there was an issue with one of your machines. We want to dial in, we want to remote in. People will just say, okay. And then they say, we're going to email you a link. Which email address should I use for your organization? Then you give them the email. Then they email you a link. And it's not going to get detected through firewalls. It's not going to get detected through any of the controls that are put in place within your organization, because they're sending you a valid email. You click on the link, they launch something to get into your computer, and now they're in. And then they escalate privilege for themselves, and they'll be able to do all sorts of crazy things. So this phishing thing is really important. It's something to be astute to. It's something to talk about with the rest of your staff. You know, maybe within RCLS, there could be a particular process or something so that you guys internally know that it is in fact RCLS that's calling, or I don't even know if RCLS would do that, John, but I think that this is one of the things that I wanted to bring up, because when you're using services, it's important to realize that, you know, somebody might see that as a vulnerability and try to exploit that. Does anybody have any questions about that? John, I don't know if you want to interject. Okay. And what I'm realizing is that
Antoinette, I'm sorry. My PC decided to give me a bit of a problem. Just to let everybody know, we use a product called TeamViewer. We usually do not jump into people's machines unless they ask us to, okay? Or if we have a project and we know that we have to jump into your machines, we usually try to let you know, but we would never contact you and ask you to do anything else like send us an email, et cetera, et cetera. Your initial call or your initial email will start the process. You contact us and we go do the job. That's the normal process. If we have to get into your machines for some reason, we will contact you directly from our office.
Right. And there should be a list of people who are authorized to do that, right? So it's not going to just be some random person. You know, maybe it's something, John, to even talk about, to have some sort of process documented for them so that they know, in fact, it is RCLS.
Sure. There's only 5 of us. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So I wanted to do this little poll. It's kind of fun. Libraries are not likely to be targeted for ransomware. As you know, I've mentioned it 1,000 times. So I'm sure everybody recognizes that this is false, because unfortunately, libraries are used as considered a soft target and have been attacked. And I put this little cute cartoon in here just because I want you all to know that it's not just people who are ignorant to cybersecurity that fall victim to it. I have a colleague who is a cybersecurity professional, wrote a book on cybersecurity. His business has been hit 3 times. And it's not because they don't have the things in place that they need to have in place. They have all the controls. It is, you know, someone accidentally clicked on something, or someone, you know, went onto a website, and it's just an accident. It's human error. And so no matter how savvy you think that you are, you need to remember that we can't let our guard down. So just some statistics about libraries that have been targeted. 30 to 60% of library victims have paid the ransom. And the statistics vary, but some are as high as 20% of the people polled said that they paid the ransom and they did not get their data back. And it's 20% is probably like the highest that'll hit, and I'll tell you why. The typical bad actors that are in fact implementing this ransomware, they consider it a business. And it's odd to say, but they want a good reputation. So usually, if an organization victimizes another organization, and the victim does not get their data back, then that aggressor, the perpetrator, is going to get a bad reputation. And so future victims are just going to not pay the ransom, because if they're not going to get their data back anyway, then their business model kind of falls apart. And so it's strange to say, but some of these ransomware organizations actually have tech support, and they set it up like a company, and they want the transaction to happen as quickly as possible so they get their money, give you back your data, and you can move on. But also recognize that now ransomware is kind of evolving into this multi-step process. Organizations will pay the ransom, they get their data back, and then all of a sudden, the perpetrators will hit up the organization for a second ransom, because they say, well, we still have your data, we still have a copy of your data, and now we're going to put it on the dark web and make it public that we were able to gain access to your network. And so often they will be hit with a second ransom. So, and that's this reinfection rate increasing because typically these bad actors will get into a network and they'll be there for a while, and they'll plant the seeds and they'll wait. They're very, very patient. And so your backups may be even if you did 6 months back, 6-month-old backups all the way back for 6 months, the backups have a high propensity to be infected, and you don't know it. And so even if you don't pay the ransom, you end up backing up the data from a previous backup, and it's already has the infection in it, and then they come back again. So 94% of the victims are running up-to-date antivirus software, and that kind of supports what I was saying earlier. A lot of times, these very sophisticated attacks, although they appear to be simple, they're sophisticated to the extent that they bypass or get past a lot of the technical controls that we put into place. It's why it's so important for us as the individuals that are operating within the networks to be vigilant and to know the types of attack and be aware of things that could be coming our way. And of course, as I mentioned several times, phishing is the most common attack vector for ransomware. All right, so I wanted to kind of give you some examples of some libraries within the last few years that have been attacked. Northampton Public Library, they were out of service for 2 weeks. So one of the things that we need to recognize when we apply for and receive and pay for cybersecurity insurance, it does not mean that everything is going to be covered. And it also doesn't mean that you're protected against an attack. I kid you not, I've heard a lot of organizations, when I talk to them about implementing controls, I hear, well, we have cybersecurity insurance. So they think that they've transferred the risk because they have insurance. And what they don't realize, it's just like car insurance. We have car insurance, but that doesn't mean you stop wearing your seatbelt and you drive 150 miles an hour on the thruway. The car insurance is there in case of an accident. The insurance, cybersecurity insurance, there is in case you're going to have an attack or a data breach. In the case of Northampton Library, they were able to, they had the cybersecurity insurance, but the investigation was not conducted. And so they had no idea of knowing what happened and how it happened because they didn't have the internal resources. And they also did not have the insurance to pay a third party. They would not pay a third party to go and do an investigation. So basically they were out for 2 weeks. They had to do their own recovery because not only was the investigation not covered, but data recovery services by a third party was not covered by their insurance. So it was very limited what they ended up. I think the insurance only was covering like the actual ransom, and everything else that they needed to do to get back up and running was not covered by insurance. So I bring this up because it's really important, if you do have cybersecurity insurance, that you clearly understand the policy, what is covered, what is not covered. Some policies do not cover third-party risk. So for example, in the SolarWinds attack that happened a couple of years ago, SolarWinds is an organization that made infrastructure for networks. And without getting into the nitty-gritty details of what they do, basically as a supplier to hundreds of thousands of their customers, their piece of equipment had a vulnerability. The bad actors recognized that, they exploited that vulnerability and so all of the equipment that these organizations were using basically was vulnerable. And that is how they got into hundreds of different companies in all different verticals. But that's considered a third-party attack. It wasn't something that the organization itself had done wrong. It was the equipment that they were using. Some cyber insurance policies will not cover those third-party risks. Also, some cybersecurity insurance policies require very specific controls to be in place in order for you to be covered. So understanding what the insurance policy looks like and what the terms and conditions are in order to know what you need to be doing in case of that breach. And then finally, when it comes to insurance, there are also very specific things that the insurance companies require you to do if in fact you do become victimized, like from the first minute that you realize that you have had a data breach. So knowing what those requirements are also is very, very important. So I suggest if you do have cyber insurance, that you revisit that policy and speak to your agent and get a really clear, precise understanding of what that policy covers. And so, as you could see, in St. Louis, Spartanburg, and Brownsburg, all of which had a very high value of data records stolen. Evidently, these are larger library systems, but in St. Louis Public Library's situation, they had 17 branches that were affected. They were only, thank goodness, out of service for 3 days, but you can imagine the amount of work that it took for them to get back on, to get back up and running. And in Brownsburg, actually, I researched that one a little bit. It took them a month to recover, and they actually had individuals manually having to scan books and put them back on the shelf one at a time to get their database rebuilt. So that was painstaking for them. All right, so what can we do? We've got just a few more slides. Obviously, like I said before, cybersecurity education and awareness for me is the #1 thing that we can do to start helping to prevent a lot of the risk that we face specifically within libraries and K-12 environments. Implementing policies and procedures is very, very important. People need to know what is expected of them. And so if you don't have policies and procedures in place that specifically outline, for example, acceptable use of technology, then you need to start thinking about that and making it clear. It does not need to be a 10-page policy or procedure, right? It needs to be clear, precise, one-pager of what the acceptable use of technology is. John, I know that RCLS manages a lot of the patch management and things like that, but hopefully everyone is running all of their technology through RCLS, because from just a lifecycle management of devices, that's the easiest way to mitigate against some of the vulnerabilities that exist within the hardware and software.
We do some. I mean, not every library uses all of our services. So some of this rests on them and some of it rests on us, really depending on how their infrastructure is configured. Typically, that's the hybrid configuration is what we like to call it here.
Yeah, and so that's, again, when I said before about knowing your vendors, right, and knowing where their responsibility ends and your responsibility begins, understanding which pieces of technology. I mean, we had a situation in Mamakating where there was a network, there was a computer that was sitting on the network that was no longer, the operating system was no longer even supported by Microsoft. And it was a public-facing computer that the patrons were using to do whatever, right? And so when I got into the board, the first thing I asked was, who's responsible for the technology? And immediately we recognized that this was an issue. And for Mamakating, we all agreed, unanimously that having RCLS manage the technology was the best fit for us, because we didn't have the resources to be able to do it internally. So really, rethinking that and making sure that if you decide to go the hybrid way, that whatever technology RCLS is not managing, that someone is responsible for making sure that the patches are updated in a timely fashion, and also that the technology that's being used on the computer, software and applications, are actually up to date and supported by the manufacturer. Multi-factor authentication, again, this is where you have a username and a credential, and then a third factor in order to authenticate an application. So the third factor is typically something you have, something you know, or something you are. So that could be a biometric, whether it be a fingerprint or facial recognition. It could be a key fob. Sometimes they have the little fobs, you hit the button. Banking uses this a lot, and it's a token, so it has a random number. But what I love to use the most is like a Google Authenticator, or I think Apple has an application as well, where every 15 or 20 seconds, it automatically generates new codes. SMS is something that a lot of organizations or companies use to push the multi-factor, but it's not secure. And so unless there's no other option, I wouldn't recommend that because it's in clear text and it can be can be intercepted. But using multi-factor authentication whenever possible is really, really best practice, great cyber hygiene, and important, because even if your credentials get compromised, if you implement that third factor, then the bad guy, can't get in. It's happened to me yesterday. I was sitting in our board of trustees meeting, and I get a notification on my phone that Samsung, was generating a code for me as a multi-factor. So I was like, oh no, my Samsung account got hacked, or is it someone's attempting to breach it? And then 2 seconds later, I get a text message from my son, and something happened with our smart TV. And he said, can you send me the code, because the remote wasn't working on the smart TV? And so that was a great opportunity for me to see this actually happen and work and mitigate somebody, even though it was my son, getting access to my technology. And then finally, staying vigilant and alert, that really is key. So what are some of the things that you can do, action items that you can do to protect the data, both in your personal life, but also within the library infrastructure? Inspect website URLs. Don't just randomly click on something, especially if somebody uses a hyperlink within a word. You have no idea what that hyperlink is behind the word in an email. Hover over the link. It will pull a pop-up box, and it'll show you what the URL looks like. If that URL is a string of random letters, numbers, or it says something .ru, or don't click on it, right? So really be vigilant about inspecting the URLs, and of course, never click on something that's unverified or suspicious. Do not open attachments that even remotely appear suspicious or unreliable. Always verify unless you're 100% sure or expecting something from someone. Do not click on attachments. Only visit and download from websites that you trust. That's really important. And even if it's a website that you trust, make sure that if you're downloading something or entering any information, that there is an HTTPS in the URL, and usually in the browser, if you're using Chrome or one of the most common browsers, there's a lock at the top, and it'll show you that that is a secure website. It's using a secure certificate that's valid. Do not download something, even if you think you trust the website, from, it could even be a benign website, but even if you think you trust the website and it does not have a secure certificate, some other third party could have went in and injected malicious code into that website if it's not secure. So just be very cognizant of that. Avoid using portable storage devices, and this includes thumb drives. And I know it's really, really challenging in the library system because you have the general public coming in. I don't know if everybody allows people to come in and use their own thumb drives, for example, to work on something on a computer or print something. But this is really dangerous because that is a very common way in which malware is transmitted, using thumb drives or portable storage devices. So it could absolutely be inadvertent too. I would say probably 9 times out of 10, somebody accidentally infects a computer through their thumb drive, not knowing. And of course, do not pick up a random thumb drive and just plug it in. If you find a thumb drive and somebody doesn't claim it within a day or two, I would just destroy it. And then of course, protect your files by storing them on regularly backed up drives. Keep your backups for a couple of months if you can, if you have the capacity to do that. Because if you just are overwriting once a week and you have been compromised and you're not aware of it, then your backups are going to be useless.
You're watching CSEN, the Cybersecurity Entertainment Network. Here's Jody Anderson.
Hi, I'm Jody Anderson with CSEN. Recently on Jeopardy, the greatest of all time, the 3 best champions were nailing just about every category that came their way, except one, cybersecurity. They whiffed on 2 of the 5 cybersecurity questions. No answers. Crickets. That's 60%. That was a D- when I was in school. It's probably a C now. Keylogger? Apparently these guys never heard of one. BYOD? No one even rang in. Bring your own device? Come on. So enjoy your day confident that you know more about cybersecurity than those brainiacs on Jeopardy!
This is your CSEN tip of the week.
Are software update notifications annoying? Kind of. I mean, you were probably getting ready to do something super important. Even if you weren't, it's an inconvenience. But when updates pop up, let it ride. Many updates are software patches to solve security flaws that have been discovered. So I know it's a hassle to reboot your computer, but these updates are to help keep you safe from malware and viruses. That's your tip of the day.
Alrighty, so we are nearing the end of our training. I know everybody was like in the greens when we first started. I hope I didn't scare anybody or upset anyone with some of the stories that I was sharing. But I'd love to know kind of how you're feeling right now about the information. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's like drinking from a fire hose. But I hope that you guys all feel, ladies and gentlemen, all feel a little bit more confident in the practices that you're going to be implementing within your own daily lives. So good. I'm glad to see everybody's in the green. So I'd like to thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to stop sharing and kind of open up the floor to questions. Jen, I don't know if you had anything in particular that you wanted me to cover or.
Nothing has come through the chat. I'm going to give it a moment.
Sure. Oh, thank you. I'm actually going to put my email address as well in the chat. I apologize, I didn't put that on the last slide. If anybody runs into anything or does have questions or needs more support, I just recently did a training last week, or actually not last week, but the very, very beginning of last week with Nanuet Library. Their cybersecurity insurance required them to do individual training within their organization. So I did very good. I swear that's my email address. So I did a training, a very specific training. They wanted to do just training on ransomware, but we're going to continue this series with RCLS. So I'm really excited about the next session. So if you don't mind, Jen, I'll just give a real quick sneak peek of what we're going to be doing. So the next session is going to be on the same topic, except it's going to be more interactive. There's going to be a review in the beginning of kind of the concepts. I won't go as deeply into it, but then we're going to do a lot of the poll everywhere questions specific. I'm going to give examples of, you know, smishing or phishing emails or things like that. And I'm going to ask specific things on what to do in various different cases. And so it's more of the application. Today was just information dump on everyone, and the next session is going to be a little bit more interactive. So I'm really excited about that. We'll definitely get more you know, engagement back and forth and kind of discussion around things. So I look forward and hope that everybody continues to do the sessions.
Thank you, Antoinette. It's just after 11. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording because nothing has come through in the way of questions.
Fantastic.